fantastic to be here. John had a slight panic because I said I'm not doing the same talk as I was doing at Lilburne Day in Bishopsgate, but it is about the Levellers, and I will be talking about John Lilburne, so I'm not talking about, I don't know, F1 racing or something instead.
Not for very long, you wouldn't imagine.
So, where better than David Cameron's constituency than to begin with a quotation from a Tory Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, or in this case in his earlier incarnation as a novelist, from his novel Civil from 1845. And in this novel, Benjamin Disraeli has this quotation which I picked up upon. "Not one man in 1,000, Disraeli said, has heard of Major John Wildman. Yet he was the soul of English politics in the most eventful period in this kingdom, and seemed more than once to hold the balance which was to decide the permanent form of our government." So, interesting quotation in that Disraeli is aware of Wildman, this Leveller figure, but he's also aware of the degree to which in the 19th century this is a movement that, as he sees it, hardly any people have heard of. People aren't aware of this critical movement of the English Civil War and Revolution. And to a certain extent, Disraeli's outlook is one that's been shared by most recent historians, in particular Blair Worden in his excellent book Roundhead Reputations. And from that perspective, the Levellers are really a group who have been recovered as part of the history of the 1640s and 1650s only in the last 100 years or so. According to this interpretation, it's only because of the emergence of Marxist and socialist historiography that we come to know who these figures, the Levellers, are. And what I want to do in this talk, actually, is challenge that interpretation and say something more broadly about the Levellers' legacy and the ways in which they were actually influential, both in their own time and also subsequently in the 18th and 19th century in Britain, and also say some comments about potential international influence. And I want to finish with something about the difficulties in terms of commemorating these groups now. One of the things I think really came out very strongly from the event at Bishopsgate was the way in which people felt that the English Revolution in general was a part of our history which was neglected, which tended to have a kind of veil drawn over it. And I want to sort of tease out some reasons why that might be the case, why this is not a part of our history that the public in general are more familiar with. So, very briefly, because John and Anne have already talked about this, but I want to kind of reiterate because it's important to what I'm going to say about posthumous influence. We're talking about a radical political movement of the mid to late 1640s, the Levellers, who advocated a new political representative for England to replace the old House of Commons, based on a broader franchise and with more equal constituencies. They also argued for the reform of the law and for the creation of what they called certain reserves. These are reserved rights such as freedom of conscience, which couldn't be infringed by either the legislature or by the executive. And as we've heard, some of the key figures are John Lilburne, Richard Overton, William Wallin, and John Wildman. John Lilburne, the most famous of all, and the one who has the most of a subsequent legacy too. And there's Lilburne, and there's Wallin. This is Wallin in his post-restoration incarnation as a medical writer, looking kind of well-fed and sort of country squire-like. These ideas are embodied in the Levellers' Manifesto, the Agreements of the People, first debated at Putney in 1647, but going through several reiterations after that in the 1640s and 1650s, and I'll talk about them in a little more detail in a moment. Of course, Levellers' Day tomorrow commemorates this, usually seen as the end point of this isn't a contemporary print, as you probably guessed. This is from a 19th century illustrated history of England. This is Cromwell suppressing the Burford mutiny, and this in May 1649 is usually seen as being the end point of the Levellers as an active political movement, as those Leveller-inspired army mutinies are crushed. And as Anna and John have already said, the Leveller leaders themselves in prison. And there's a fuzzy picture of the plaque from Burford Church commemorating those executed mutineers. So, one argument about the levellers, one that's pushed, if you like, by some of the more, let's say, kind of full-on revisionist historians, as we call them, is that actually concentrating on the levellers, as much as historians have done recently, is itself disproportionate, and that, in fact, as interesting as these individuals, this movement is, they didn't actually have much contemporary influence. They didn't matter that much in contemporary terms. They didn't change much. That's something I want to very quickly challenge and just show you a number of ways in which I think the levellers were significant in their own time. Now, one thing here is actually the agreements themselves, and how long over the 1640s and 50s the idea of this agreement of the people seems to retain life and vitality as a way of settling the kingdom, as a way of creating a lasting political settlement. One of the things that's come out, I think, from some interesting recent research, both myself, Jason Pesey and others, is the way in which some of these documents, which previously have been seen as sort of shabby compromises, namely the officers' agreement, which is the version of the agreement of the people cooked up between the civilian levellers and the army leadership, was actually given more serious consideration as a form of settlement. This is actually a British Library copy, an MS copy, and the really interesting thing, which you won't be able to see because it's so fuzzy there, is right down the bottom there's a little bit of scribble that says this is the copy to be signed by the officers. So what we get from that, and we'll get from the evidence that there are about 5,000 copies of this printed, is that they were already preparing to send this out for people to subscribe to in the counties to show their approval for this new form of settlement. And we know from the evidence of actually opposition petitions from people who were opposed to the levellers programme and the officers' agreement, that this subscription process was probably already taking place. Now, it doesn't lead to the implementation of this agreement, but what we do know from the work of David Smith is that the officers' agreement had an influence on the protectoral constitutions. The clauses relating to religious freedom in the instrument of government, the first protectoral constitution, are virtually identical to the clauses in the officers' agreement. So again, it's being used as a template in contemporary politics well after 1649. And we could talk in broader terms, going back to some of the things that Anne has mentioned about the broader political influence of the levellers, their use of print, their use of mass petitioning, their use of mass demonstrations. These are things which then continue to be important in terms of later 17th century politics, as Tim Harris has shown. And they continue to have a bearing on the 18th century as well. Now, a couple of visual depictions of 18th century invocations of the English Revolution. This is a rather nice, I think it's Cruikshank print. The fellow at his desk is Richard Price, and the big nose emerging out of a cloud is Edmund Burke. And this is the Burke-Price debate that presages the more famous Burke-Payne debate. And Burke is shown here finding Price out, because what Price has above his desk is a picture of Charles I's execution, which underneath it says, "The glory of Great Britain." So the idea is that all these radical dissenters are really secretly murderous regicides in disguise. And a similar sort of message from this slightly earlier print by James Sayers, The Mirror of Patriotism. We've got the back of Charles James Fox here, giving a speech in the mirror, but what is the reflection? It's Oliver Cromwell. Okay, so here the English Revolution is being invoked as a negative stereotype of violent radicalism. But this isn't the only way in which the memory of the levellers and of English radicalism of the 17th century has an 18th century impact. The levellers, in fact, continue to have a persistent presence in 18th century historiography. And contrary to historians such as Worden, who argue that that presence was a distorted one, that the levellers were presented as something that they weren't, as social levellers, as people like the Diggers who wanted to change the social and economic structure of England, contemporaries in the 18th century were aware of the nature of the levellers' political and religious radicalism. John Oldmixon, the 18th century Whig historian and polemicist, said, "What is said of the levellers being against all degrees of honour or riches and levelling the count with the cobbler is false." So he's saying this is a calumny on the levellers, this isn't true. So the levellers are actually most often in the historiography represented in the way that I've just described, as political radicals, advocating popular sovereignty, advocating civil rights, advocating more open democracy. The reason for this is that they didn't fit very well into the 18th century Whig-Tory party split. So they couldn't really be very easily moulded into these Whig or Tory, pictures. So they were less subject to distortion. The other reason that these ideas continue to be conveyed sort of relatively accurately is that they continue to be well outside of the 18th century political mainstream. If you wanted to condemn the levellers, you didn't need to turn them into something else. They're already beyond the pale in 18th century terms anyway. And there's a sidebar to this, which is that the levellers get talked about because they get pulled into a debate about the accuracy of the Earl of Clarendon's history of the Great Rebellion, one of the most important histories of the Civil War. And as a way of Clarendon's critics sort of attacking him, they take issue with his picture of the levellers. So they try and show that they can produce a more accurate picture of the levellers than the Earl of Clarendon. Clarendon sort of says things about levellers' royalist conspiracy activities in the 1650s and so on. But it's not just about history writing, it's not just about historiography in the 18th century. The levellers are continuing to exert an influence upon 18th century politics as well. And the figure of Lilburne is a really important part of this story of 18th century influence. His struggles and the way in which he used the courtroom as a political theatre, as illustrated by this picture from his 1649 trial, resonated with 18th century struggles. In particular, the struggles of the later 18th century radical John Wilkes, also involved in causes relating to the freedom of the press, as Lilburne was. And there are other similarities here too. John's talked about the way in which sort of Lilburne was the most sort of celebrated of the figures, radical figures of the 17th century. And that was because of this kind of, what Mike Brannock's called sort of celebrity aspect to him. That prints were made of Lilburne, as was on that poster which has just dropped down, various sort of other artefacts. And in the same way, Wilkes has this kind of iconography and memorabilia created about him. There's this personality cult around this figure. The figure of the radical himself is very important. But it's not just about the style of politics. There's also a genuine influence in terms of the law over the 18th century. Somerset's case, some of you might have heard of this famous test case, often seen as abolishing slavery in England. The lawyers for the slave in this case, James Somerset, used an obscure 16th century precedent, so-called Cartwright's case, to argue that, quote, the air of England was too pure for a slave to breathe. The case is about a Tudor merchant, Cartwright, who's supposed to have beaten his Russian slave, and he's arrested Cartwright for assault. And Cartwright says, well, he's my slave, I can do what I want with him. And the court says, no, he's in England, he has to be treated differently, you can't just, treat him as your chattel slave and beat him. The evidence, though, for this 16th century precedent only came through John Lilburne's 1646 appeal for compensation as a result of his punishments by Star Chamber in 1638. So Lilburne's defence lawyers argue that Lilburne shouldn't have been treated in this way, he shouldn't have been whipped from Fleet Prison to Newgate because of this 16th century precedent from Cartwright's case. So again, Lilburne's exerting his courtroom struggles, exerting a tangible impact. And I think this is something that actually resonates with 17th century debates and language as well. And I've just taken this quote from a 1659 debate from the MP Edward Boscawen. This was a talk about a petition from some ex-cavaliers who'd been enslaved in Barbados. Enslavement or sending off as indentured labourers was a common punishment for political prisoners and prisoners of war during the 1640s and 1650s. And Boscawen says, I'm as much against the Cavalier party as any man in these wars, but you have Paul's case before you. A Roman ought not to be beaten. When he says Roman, he means an Englishman. We are miserable slaves if we may not have this liberty secured to us. These persons come to justify themselves. If you pass this, our lives will be as cheap as those Negroes. So the language of slavery, the language of liberty, is really important in the 17th century as well. And as in the 18th century, it's connected to the actual existence of slavery and the threat of slavery. Lilburne is also an important figure in terms, as I mentioned, in the case of Wilt, the case of liberty of the press, and, by extension, the power of juries and libel law. In 1649 and 1653, Lilburne is acquitted by 2 juries, and in both cases he manages to convince these juries that they are judges, as he calls it, of law as well as fact. So they can decide not only the facts of the case, but whether the laws that he's being judged by are just, are legal. As a result of these campaigns, Lilburne becomes an icon for those arguing for liberty of the press in the 18th century. But it's not about just him being fixed on as this sort of 17th century predecessor. These actions have legal influence. Charles James Fox, who's pictured there, introduces the 1792 Libel Act, also known as Fox's Act. And in his speech promoting this piece of legislation, Fox directly refers to Lilburne's 1649 trial and says that what we need to do in libel cases is contrary to what was the established practice at the time, where the jury could only decide whether somebody or not had authored a particular libel, that they need to be able to, the jury need to be able to judge the full matter of the case. They need to be able to decide whether the matter contained in this text is actually libelous or not. So he uses Lilburne as an argument for greater powers for the juries in judging libel cases. And this is an act which continues to regulate libel law today.
3 minutes.
3 months, okay. Okay. Yeah, I'm coming on to some of those things. Yeah. So, that's about British influence in the 18th century, focusing on Lilburne, but we're also talking about a movement here that arguably has considerable international influence. Now, for those of you who remember, the late great Tony Benn, Tony Benn, in some of his writings on the Levellers, talked about the ways in which their ideas prefigured the ideas of the American Revolution, a precursor to the ideas embodied in the Declaration of Independence. One of the problems that's confronted historians with that idea is that figures like Jefferson don't seem to have owned any Leveller works. So how can we tell whether they've been influenced by the Levellers in any sort of way? One of the interesting things, however, and this has come through research by Fred Donnelly, is that though Jefferson didn't own any Leveller works, he did own numerous compendia and histories of the Civil Wars. And what Donnelly has found is that Jefferson, probably about 200 or so times, refers to Rushworth's collections within his speeches. And so, indirectly, there may well be an influence from Leveller ideas, Leveller writings, upon the American founding fathers. The other interesting thing that's coming out of recent research too is about continental influence. Lilburne wrote in Dutch when he went into exile, promoting his ideas in the Netherlands. And as Jason Pesey has also shown, Levellers themselves were influenced by Dutch political arrangements, by this example of this non-monarchical state, as perhaps a better way of arranging political affairs than those presently in England. And there's also potential French influence here as well, because the Agreement of the People is also translated into French, and it's disseminated amongst the French rebels of the mid-17th century, the Frondeurs. Now, what we don't know in those cases is how far that influence is transmitted down into the 18th and 19th centuries, but it's something where possibly the creation of more kind of digital libraries of 18th century pamphlet literature and so on might well give us some interesting clues. And there is the Declaration of Independence. But I want to finish off by showing you some of my holiday pictures. I'm not joking. So very recently I went to New England. I had a fellowship at a library there in Connecticut, and I took the opportunity to do a bit of 17th century sightseeing. How many of you have heard the story of Edward Whalley and William Gough? Some of you? Yeah, okay. Well, if you go to this part of New England, everybody's heard this story. Yeah, everybody knows who you're talking about if you say the Regicides, Regicides Cave, Judge's Cave, William Gough, Edward Whalley. They know who you're talking about. So just outside of New Haven, there's West Rock Park, which has a Regicides Trail in it, and it also has, as you can see here, the Judge's Cave. This is my Regicide selfie. And the Judge's Cave is where these two English regicides, two men who signed the death warrant for Charles I, Edward Whalley and William Gough, hid out from royal agents. So they secreted themselves within, it's not actually a cave, it's two big boulders kind of sitting together between them. Very small space, they must have been smaller in the 17th century. And final picture, it's not just rocks and so on. If you go to New Haven itself, on the College Green, there is a memorial to the third of these English regicides who escaped to New England, John Dixwell. That's his original gravestone, and behind it is the memorial there as well. So it's quite prominent in the centre of New Haven. Now, the reason for showing you these pictures is not just to tell you what a lovely time I had in Connecticut, but is also to think about public memory. I think it's very hard to imagine something similar existing in England. You know, can you imagine a kind of Regicides Trail in an English context? It's hard to think of such a thing existing in this country. And I think this brings us to the point about the Levellers and memory. I don't think this is actually a story of rediscovery. It's not like, you know, the Crossrail dig, and suddenly, you know, in the 19th century, we dig up all this stuff about the Levellers that we never knew before. The Levellers' writings are freely available. They're cheaply available from booksellers in the 18th century. It's no problem getting hold of a pamphlet by Lilburne. Okay? Lots and lots of stuff there. There are mentions of the Levellers in 18th century historiography, in 18th century newspapers, and so on. So why isn't the English Revolution more central to our historical consciousness? And I think this is about political repression. I think this is actually about some conscious, you know, obscuring of an important part of our history. And you can take the regicide here as a really key example. Okay? We had, up until the mid-19th century, as part of the formal church calendar, the requirement for sermons on the date of Charles I's execution. 30th of January, you had these sermons, you know, expressing sadness at you know, the death of Charles I. But the interesting thing about those sermons is that the vast majority of them never mentioned what had gone on. You know, they would have these very vague sermons about the importance of obedience, the importance of humility, and so forth. Never actually talked about the regicide itself, who was involved, what it was about. It was the elephant in the room, you know, not actually talking about the thing that you were supposedly commemorating. And I think that discomfort actually persists today. Another little personal anecdote, I take my students to the banqueting house as part of my English Civil War third year option when we do the week on the regicide. It's the site of where, you know, where Charles I was executed. Until this year, when you went into the main banqueting hall, there was a big display, lots of stuff about January the 30th, and a big image of Charles I, like a woodcut image with his head cut off. Okay, I went back there this year. All of that stuff had gone, and I said, "Oh, that's strange. Where's all your stuff about, you know, the regicide gone?" He said, "Oh, well, we had some complaints. They didn't like the image of, you know, Charles I with his head cut off." I said, "But he did have his head cut off." "Oh no, some people found it offensive." So I think we've still got, there's this discomfort about talking about the 1640s and 1650s, and I think perhaps in the case of the Levellers, some of that discomfort is actually, we're talking about the difference between the 17th and the 21st century, but perhaps some of that discomfort is actually because we don't seem to have come that far. You know, I mean, I was talking about the ways in which the Levellers tried to protect or create rights that were protected from executive or legislative, you know, squashing and removal. And here we are in 2015 with a government that wants to do away with human rights. So I think this is, you know, it is not simply the case that the Civil War is too complicated. It's not simply the case that the Levellers are peripheral. It's because this part of our history is difficult to talk about in the context of the political traditions and if you like, you know, the political establishment that continues to dominate.